The final presentation in this segment is going to be presented by me because I think it's really important that we try to address the legislative concerns that keep coming up, particularly from a variety of groups. I've been working on this issue now for 8 years, and there's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of misinterpretation of data. And so I decided to put it all in one big paper. It is on your CD, and I'm going to try and compress it into 20 minutes. It doesn't have any fancy pictures on it. So if you need to have a stand up just for a second and a stretch, because I would love you to be able to focus on this so that you will go away armed with the knowledge of what is perhaps fact and not fact. Okay, have a seat and we'll get started. Well, you can stand while I talk if you'd like to. You're very welcome to do that. If you're tired of sitting down, you're welcome to stand at the back, or if that helps keep you awake. I know I need that sometimes. Okay, the background to this. Well, those of you, who was at the 2006 Summit? Okay, some of you not. The 2006, which is the very first summit we had. Okay, at that summit, it was the first time, I think, that every representative group from around Australia had been brought together, and we actually spent an hour and a half sharing our euthanasia, just as to encourage everybody to say, let's come forward and be honest about this so that we know the size of the problem, so that we can move forward. So what came out of that first summit was the need for legislation to require cats and dogs to be desexed prior to sale or transfer. And there has been progress in some states towards microchipping prior to sale or transfer, because it is required in New South Wales, I believe, prior to sale or transfer, microchipping, ACT, Victoria and now Queensland, and it is proposed, I believe, in Tassie and Western Australia. There's also been progress in some states towards desexing of cats and or dogs, with the Australian Capital Territory, of course, having cats from 3 months and dogs from 6 months. They have to be desexed unless you want to get a permit to have an entire animal. Some local governments in Victoria have introduced that as well from 3 months, and state government in Victoria requires all cats and dogs from pounds and shelters to be desexed before they're sold, but that's the only state that requires that. So the issue is that it's not prior to sale or transfer, and as Jade mentioned, the same with microchipping, that can leave a gap. And so except for the Gold Coast City Council pilot project and what is being proposed in Tassie, and I thought, as Ros said before, I thought they were proposing in Western Australia to do prior to sale or transfer too, but it looks like at the moment they've thrown that out and decided to stick with the 6 months. So in terms of what data we have, of course, there was a fairly substantial piece of research done by Linda Marsden in Victoria, which involved 3 shelters, the Lost Dogs Home, the RSPCA and the Cat Protection Society. Then there's the RSPCA Shelters Research Australia-wide that Corinne has been doing, that's only just been completed, so we don't really have much that's going to be published shortly. But then there's the direct data from pounds and shelters, and there's the RSPCA national data that they've been providing regularly, annually, every year for some time now. There's the New South Wales Government pounds statewide stats, and then there's the whole of city data in the Gold Coast that we've been gathering now since 2001-2 and computerised since 5-6. The other thing that's been happening is that in order to work out the solutions, there needs to be a lot of collaboration. I totally agree with that. And so in 2004, we formed a stakeholder coalition, and it included the main dog breed organisation in Queensland, which is Dogs Queensland. It included the 3 of the 4 main cat breed organisations. The others were invited, obviously, but didn't come. But we had 3 of the main ones around the table. We had the AVA from Queensland there, the RSPCA, Little Paws Kitten Rescue to represent the rescue organisations, Gold Coast City Council, Department of Local Government statewide, and also the wildlife groups, because they have an interest in this as well, because while they don't want to see cats and dogs marauding over wildlife, they also care about cats and dogs. So from that developed the breeder permit system, which has taken years of consultation in a way, because I remember when we first started back in 2004, the vet that came to the meeting representing the AVA didn't know anything about early age desexing either. So that kind of stunned me coming in fresh in 2004 to think, well, even the vets who were representing the AVA didn't know whether early age desexing was safe or not. So that's where we've come from to this point today. And so the breeder permit system, I guess, is a result of thinking, yes, do we want compulsory desexing? At what age do we need to start it? So we come up with this system, which Jeff explained to you, which applies to anyone who breeds, commercial, hobby, accidental, anyone. It requires, I mean, when I say it's a system, that's why I'm going through these things. So it's not isolated bits and pieces, as Jade mentioned, that we seem to have scattered all over Australia and in bits and pieces in different states. Regular government inspection based on compulsory standards. A breeder pays for the breeder permit system. Since they're the ones bringing the animals into the world and want to sell them, it's appropriate that they should want to have some sort of accreditation that says we've been inspected and we're doing the right thing, and then consumers have information about who to buy from. So it's kind of an overall package. It also addresses overbreeding of kittens. So it sort of addresses the puppy mill issue, but it addresses overbreeding of kittens in that kittens must be desexed prior to sale or transfer. But we made the sale or transfer date 10 weeks because there'd been a lot of debate about, well, can you desex a kitten safely at 8 weeks when it's got to be vaccinated first? So to overcome that, we looked at the research, and it's saying that basically all the cat breeding organisations around the table agreed it was far better for the kittens to be there with their mum till 10 weeks anyway, and then it gave the time for the desexing to occur prior to sale or transfer. And we know from what Jeff's told us and from what Jackie's told us, early age desexing is perfectly safe for kittens. There's not any research to indicate there's any problem at all with kittens, although there's those little bits and pieces for puppies. So basically, it incorporates that into the breeder permit system as well. And because we have more kittens pouring into our shelters seasonally, and because of their excessively high breeding rate, we were happy just to go ahead with kittens rather than kittens and puppies, because there's still a bit of contention about puppies, and also I think most of you would agree we don't have the same volume of puppies needing to be rehomed as we do kittens. And the other issue is it's administered by animal welfare in terms of having some support of desexing subsidies, which we believe is absolutely essential when you're lobbying for this. That, you know, a lot of people have argued, oh, it won't be fair to the animals if we bring this in because a lot of animals will be dumped, but they won't be if it's managed well and there are desexing support processes available. It's essential they come in at the same time. Of course, we need exemptions for areas like we saw that Julia had on the screen yesterday, where it's a totally different situation for remote communities. So we're not suggesting that this applies to remote communities. And we also totally agree that microchipping needs to be tracked right back to the breeder. So just about in every state that has got microchipping already, it still doesn't require the breeder's details to be on that microchip. As long as they transfer it and microchip it, it can have the first owner's details on there. So that's where we've got a bit of a flaw in the system so far. Now, the desexing legislation concerns. Let's see if we can tackle some of these. So the pet industry and animal welfare are aligned in terms of compulsory microchipping, but there seems to have been some differences about compulsory desexing. Even though neither of them have had a great uptake, there's a strong support from the pet industry about microchipping, but not about desexing. So the first one is the majority of cats in pounds and shelters are unowned and therefore would not be affected by desexing legislation. Okay, so there's just a few points here that are really important. First of all, in the Victorian study, it said 80% of cats entering 3 major shelters had no owners or were semi-owned, 80 to 20. But That was only 3 shelters in the whole of Melbourne. There's lots of other shelters in Melbourne. They happen to be 3 of the largest shelters, and a lot of them have council contracts, which influences the ratio of animals that come in to those shelters. It depends on your policy. Your policy will also affect whether people are willing to surrender to your shelter, because they won't surrender to you if they think their animal's going to be killed. So just to use 3 shelters is not really valid data if you want to look at the big picture. It's also not a whole city intake. So on the Gold Coast, we've got that whole of city intake. And what we see is that 40 to 50% of the animals that come in are surrendered by their owners. They're not stray, right? Then 8% of the strays are reclaimed by their owners, and 40% of the strays are already desexed. And when you put those two together as a proportion of all incoming animals, that equals 20% of the intake of animals. Therefore, 60% are definitely owned that come into a whole of city intake. And that kind of reflects what Corinne was showing yesterday, where there was a much higher proportion of owned animals in RSPCA data than there actually is in that study that was done in Victoria. The second thing that, you really have to read the research really finely to get these points, but in the Victorian study, the definition of a stray is a cat that lives in proximity to humans and utilises resources associated with human environments, but who is not intentionally supported by an identified person, right? An actual roaming around, unowned animal. But as you and I know, and those in the animal management field in this room, a stray in a pound or a shelter is any cat or dog impounded due to wandering at large. It doesn't mean that they're not completely unowned, like the definition in the Victorian data. And yet we've got confused, and some of the pet industry people have picked this up and confused the issue because simply of the definition of stray. And we know, for example, that most stray dogs are owned because 70 to 78% of whole city intake of dogs have been strays, and yet 70% of them reclaimed by their owners. So obviously owned. So stray does not, in our definition in pounds, mean a cat wandering around in the environment who is not intentionally supported by an identified person. It's just a wandering animal, and largely they're owned. And similarly, cats, we believe, are largely owned. First of all, you've got that nearly 50% that were surrendered by their owners. But if you look at the strays, cat owners can rarely be contacted because only 3 to 10% are reclaimed by their owners annually because they don't have a microchip or they don't have a tag, because we haven't been very good at doing that as well as we have for dogs. So a lot of the time you can't even contact the owner, but they might very well be owned. And they pretty much look like they're owned. They're in beautiful condition, as you know, those of you who work in shelters, aren't they? Lovely condition, usually well socialised, maybe a bit shy and timid, but they're usually pretty good. Secondly, we have a bit of a laissez-faire attitude to cats in Australia, so we have this difficulty of containing cats in our own yard. So I'm an owner, and yet we let our cats go over the fence because we think, oh, well, it's a bit hard to do that. And we're only just starting to educate owners now about keeping cats in their own yard. So that's a second reason why there's an awful lot of those cats that come in as strays are likely to be owned animals, because owners let them jump over the fence because we still don't have ocelot rolling things on the top of our fence or fully enclosed yards. The third thing, and this is supported by research in America, was that owners assume cats that are wandering, their own cats, will come back. And research in America showed that animal agencies play such a small role in recovery of lost cats because owners of lost cats don't contact them, the same as they do for dogs, because they assume that they will come back. And so they don't bother even contacting the council for at least 5 days. And of course that's verified in that 66% of the 73 cats in this study recovered and returned home on their own. So owners are sort of thinking, oh, well, that's the cat, they'll come back. So these animals are ending up in shelters. They're stray, but it doesn't mean they're not owned. Additionally, some owners refuse to pay the impound fee to get their cat out of the pound, partly because there's so many of them out there, partly because probably they are more independent and their owners can let them go easier than they can a dog because they don't have maybe that same close affinity. And also, we know the majority of the public and AMO admitted strays, even in, this is Victorian study data, are tolerant of or actively sociable with humans, which means they've definitely had an owner. And less than 2% in the whole city on the Gold Coast are feral cats. Now, I know that will vary up to 10%, I think Corinne found in her data. So could be up to 10% might be feral, but that's still only a small proportion. So therefore, desexing legislation prior to sale or transfer will not only have an effect on all these owned animals, all these owned cats and dogs, because the majority of them are owned, but it will also have a big impact on all those owned cats that currently jump the fence. Who's ever had a cat that they let jump the fence? Okay, so over half the people in this room, and I'm sure you're all loving animal owners. And I do it myself. I've done it myself. I'm lucky I live on acreage now, but so I don't have any neighbours nearby where it's going to cause any problem for people. So they're just in my area. So if the majority of owned cats can jump the fence and become stray and wander at large for the average of 5 days, then just by having a requirement that you have to get a breeder permit if you want to breed from them, or you have to get your animal desexed, is going to have an impact on those animals that are wandering around stray and getting pregnant and having babies that are then not picked up, but then have babies and end up as further strays. And if we look at the proportion of those animals that are wandering around that are undesexed, this is our data from the Gold Coast, you can see that virtually none, it's adults and kittens 2 to 6 months of age. So the blue is the number of kittens that are of desexing age. They're over 2 months, but they're maximum of 6 months because they're still kittens. You can see the proportion of kittens that were stray that are already desexed, and we know that cats can breed from 4 months of age. So in that category, in that red category, which is the kittens that are not desexed, roaming around as strays, which is nearly 98%. From 4 months of age, those kittens have the capacity to be breeding. And in the surrendered category, as you can see, there's still a fairly large proportion of both kittens and adult cats that come in as owned animals that are still not desexed. So there's where we have the problem. So desexing legislation prior to sale or transfer will have an impact on the majority of animals which are owned that come into shelters and pounds, and also on those that wander as strays that we own because we let them jump the fence. And Rick Nattrass actually has, way back in 1993, said the domestic and feral cat populations are not separate or discrete populations. There is a flow of individual cats in both directions, with almost certainly a much larger number of domestic cats entering the wild than the reverse. Obviously, if all domestic cats capable of straying to the wild were desexed, these animals would be unable to establish or significantly help to maintain a viable feral population if they so strayed. So my point is here that desexing legislation will both have an impact on the owned animals that are coming in and the stray animals. So we need to sort of debunk that myth. The majority of owned animals are already desexed, and therefore the legislation is unnecessary, is another argument we hear. So let's have a look. The New South Wales Government pound data for 2009-10, which you just got, which is straight from basically the report that you've got on your CD, and so you can check it yourself. It says 187,649 of the 192,003 cats with cat registration on the New South Wales register are desexed. Remember you saw on the screen that Vaughan had up 98% desexed, right? But that's 98% of cats on the New South Wales pet register whose owners have registered them. So here's where data can be very, very confusing if you don't read it carefully. If you take the proportion of that 187,000 of the total of 441,000 owned cats that are on the register, only 42% are desexed. And if you take that 170,000 as a proportion of the estimated total number of pet cats in New South Wales, estimated by the pet industry, that's 724,000 cats, it's only 26%. So we've got to be very careful of these stats that we're being presented with. Secondly, the Queensland Government Household Survey, where everybody says 93.5% of households with a cat over 3 months of age, now just listen to this bit, had at least one cat that was desexed. But it says, if you read the full paper, the responses do not allow for the inference that all cats 3 months or older in a household were desexed. They only found out if one of their cats was desexed. And, given the sample size used in the Queensland Household Survey, the relatively low occurrence of implementation of cat administrative measures, which is registration and microchipping, because it's only just come in Queensland, in conjunction with the relatively low occurrence of households with cats, did not produce sufficient numbers to generate robust estimates and enable clear discrimination between regions. And when you look at the feline arrivals in 2009-10 in the Gold Coast, which is the whole of city data, and by the way, the number I've put on your CD, just cross this out, I don't know what I was thinking at the time. I added up the two blues, and so it's too high. But it's still a very good figure in terms of giving an example of how many kittens we are getting in. If you look at the dark blue on the right-hand side, which is 44%, aged 1 to 3 months. This is in a whole of city population. So 44% were litters of kittens under 3 months, and the red, 7%, were litters of kittens 4 to 6 months of age. So that means in total, 51% of the incoming felines in a whole of city are unwanted kittens. So that just sort of backs up also that data that we also heard from Corinne yesterday, that there's a large proportion out there, and Jackie. The next thing we often hear is that mandatory desexing laws have not been shown to be effective. So let's have a look at that. First of all, in the USA, the definition of mandatory varies greatly across communities. In some localities, a citation may be issued for any animal over the age of 4 months, if unaltered. In other communities, a citation results only when another animal control offence has been committed, or if more than one unspayed female lives in the household. So it's imprudent to generalise about the effects of mandatory spay-neuter laws. So if people are saying something doesn't work, then we need to look at, well, what's the detail of that legislation, and what is it that maybe is a problem with where it's been administered to or how it's been administered that's the issue, not just slam the whole thing. There's good legislation which encourages ethical and social responsibility. Would any of you not want drink driving legislation? Would any of you not support smoking legislation? Legislation can be good and legislation can be bad. What we're saying is that we need breeding legislation for social responsibility about breeding. So with the drink driving and the smoking, what we're saying by having legislation and all the education that goes with it is that social responsibility sometimes has to override individual desires. And that's all we're saying about responsible breeding permits. We're saying you might want to have a litter of kittens in your house, or you might want to breed puppies, but overall, social responsibility needs to override your personal desires when there is a problem. So to say that just mandatory desexing doesn't work, first of all, you can't generalise, and secondly, mandatory desexing doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. If you look at the reasons for not desexing cats over the last 2 months, over 2 months of age on the Gold Coast, this is whole of city data, you can see that one of the biggest patches is that 32% just didn't get around to it. So breeder permits will help requiring kittens to be desexed will give them a little bit of a motivation to get it done, because nobody generally likes getting a fine. Nobody likes having somebody come in knocking on their door and saying, you know, you've done the wrong thing. The majority of people, if they have that little bit of extra push, will want to do the right thing. I know it took me a while to get used to putting my seatbelt on, and yet I'm a generally law-abiding citizen. So it's very important that we just give that little bit of extra encouragement to people to say this is socially responsible behaviour. The second reason you notice there on the top in the blue is 14% for cost, and on the left-hand side, 34% thought that their animals were too young, and these are cats over 2 months of age. So it comes back to this whole education about early age desexing again. So we believe legislation plus a support program equals success. It sets the expectation of what society expects and is an incentive to act. And the Queensland Government contributed $20,000 to the legislation that we've just introduced on the Gold Coast. And there's no reason why we can't do some of the things we talked about yesterday, where there's a combined and shared arrangement between local veterinarians, animal welfare groups and state and local government to help the people who can't comply with the legislation to comply. National consistency, totally agree that that's a big issue. We've only introduced it on the Gold Coast so far. We need national consistency. Okay, here's another argument we hear as well. Mandatory desexing will present an enormous management and cost impost onto councils and, of course, ratepayers. Well, no, not if the breeder permit system is a user pays system, where the breeder pays for the permit costs, for the inspection by the local government and for the administration of that paperwork, and the Gold Coast City Council has decided it will be $369. We're not saying that's perfect, but that's what we've set it at. It can vary. But as long as the breeder is recognising that they're the ones that are adding to this issue of unwanted animals, and therefore, if they want to continue to breed, then they need to be able to be accredited breeders and prove to the public by inspection that they're not puppy mills and that they're not going to put out little kittens into the world that are going to have to be killed, or other animals are going to have to be killed because they've put more kittens out into the world. Next one, desexing threatens income and careers of vets and the pet industry. Who's heard of that argument before? Okay, it's been a significant argument since 2004. In 2004, the Pet Industry Association, Pet Industry Advisory Service, which is basically a pet food company's group, paid for Dr. Chris Baldock, an epidemiologist, to go around and talk to every veterinary association in Australia with the topic, are you desexing your way out of a job? Now that was very cheeky, because when you look at Chris Baldock's data, it's about declining households wanting pets. That's what he was raising awareness of. He had the data to show that there's a slightly decreasing number of pet households now in both dogs and cats. But what's happened is, and you'll hear it all the time being sprouted in government documents being put out that say, this is when we're after, change in legislation, we get things all the time saying there's a declining numbers of cats and dogs. It's not at all. It's declining households wanting cats and dogs, and that's because of all those things on the screen, right? And that even makes desexing even more important, because if we've got fewer households wanting animals, we obviously are going to have to do more desexing. So the argument that we need, that the issue of that desexing has to be stopped because there's declining numbers of cats and dogs is not rational. The other issue is that, sorry, I've lost it a bit. Okay, over the years there's been various articles like no pets, no vets. The single biggest threat to the income and careers of most vets in Australia is declining cat and dog numbers. So there you see it again. It should say there's declining cat and dog households, and therefore we need to desex more animals and we need to get more pet-friendly accommodation. That's the solution if we want more pets. The Pet Industry Advisory Service, arguments against compulsory desexing in 2002, said a similar thing. The decline in the household cat population is a serious problem which will have enormous implications for the public, veterinary profession and the pet care industry. So I do understand the concerns of vets and the pet industry. They want to obviously sustain their business, and we do obviously want vets in the community. I'm not saying we don't want vets in the community, but we want responsibly owned animals that will be able to go to vets for their whole life, not animals that have to end up in a pound or a shelter being killed. So the breeder permit system allows anyone to apply for a permit to breed. It doesn't prohibit breeding. It's just going to mean more responsible breeders, fewer puppy mills and kittens desexed. The majority of dogs entering shelters were relinquished for behavioural reasons and are not rehomable, therefore there's not really an issue, is another argument you'll hear. And we've already had a bit of data on this from Corinne and from a few other people today, so I won't go into that in much detail, but you can see that behaviour is only a very small proportion of the reasons why dogs end up in pounds and shelters. Another argument is that other strategies are more important than legislation. But shouldn't we be working on all strategies? It's not either or, but it's both and. Let's support the full range of strategies to reduce the numbers of unwanted cats and dogs. And it's the full range that's in the G2Z model. So we want better shelter care. All the stuff we've been hearing from Kate is about caring for the animals better. But that's not stopping them coming in. We want better rehoming strategies. Yes, we can work on that. That's fantastic. With all the work that Pet Rescue's doing, it is brilliant stuff. But it's still not solving the underlying issue of having animals being born at particular times where we just can't find enough homes for them, no matter how much we put the effort in. So we need better education, we need better owner support with desexing subsidies, and we need better legislation. And I mean, even Nathan Winograd, we read his book Redemption, where he slams legislation, for those of you who've read that, but he himself wants legislation. What he wants is rigorous and comprehensive expectations codified in law. He wants that for pound and shelter directors to make them use the life-saving programs of the no-kill equation. So Nathan himself is in favour of legislation as long as it's applied appropriately and is going to make a difference to the numbers of unwanted cats and dogs. And what we're saying is breeder permit legislation is similar, and all it's saying is we want rigorous and comprehensive expectations for breeders. So I don't believe that it's at odds with what Nathan is talking about. Risks of early age desexing, won't go into that at all because Jeff's just given us all the data about that. We don't need to worry about that one anymore. Mandatory desexing takes away an owner's and a vet's right to choose. Well, that's absolutely not the case. What we want is responsible owners of domestic cats and dogs to choose to breed if they wish and get a breeder permit and have an inspection. Nobody's stopping anybody doing that. So that doesn't take away the owner's right to choose. It also doesn't require anybody who has a show dog to even get a permit. It's only saying you have to get a permit when you decide to breed. So if you have a beautiful little show dog and you want to keep it to see if it's going to have breeding potential, then you can do that and you don't have to get a permit. So it's no problem for those people. Vets also can choose not to desex an animal if the animal is likely to be at serious risk if desexed. That's in our breeder permit legislation. So if the little animal has a bad heart or is not well in some way, then it's absolutely fine to give an exemption in writing. That's what it says in the legislation. So it doesn't take away the vet's right to choose. In actual fact, it helps the vets. But the only problem is that with the lack of knowledge of early age desexing, that's not an excuse. And some of the vets are using that as an excuse. So they're not doing it, they're not following the legislation because they say, oh, we can't do early age desexing because that might put the animal at risk. But we know that it doesn't put a healthy animal at risk. So that's not a valid reason for avoiding doing the right thing. Another argument is there are already existing powers to address poor breeders. And we've just heard from Jade that shows all the gaps in the legislation. So I don't really need to go into that one either. There's huge gaps in the legislation. For example, animal welfare laws do not require an initial or regular inspection of breeders. A breeder permit system like we've introduced on the Gold Coast does. It requires a complaint first, so it's totally reactive. The current legislation has no requirement to keep breeder details on the microchip. The current legislation has no system for consumers to determine whether a puppy or a kitten comes from a puppy mill or not. And there's no national system that requires breeders to sell that stops breeders selling interstate and avoiding laws like we've got on the Gold Coast. So at the moment the legislation's got holes in it everywhere. Breeder organisations actually support breeder permits and desexing of kittens in Queensland. Insufficient standards to require socialisation and responsibility for rehoming for the life of each animal. There are breeder permits. There are currently breeder permits out there, and there are currently codes of practice, but there's not enough emphasis on the socialisation of animals and the responsibility for rehoming and the willingness to take an animal back. Dogs Queensland have been working with us now for 8 years, and the man who comes along representing Dogs Queensland breeds golden retrievers. And if he finds that one of his animals isn't going to stay forever with its home that he adopted it to, he makes those owners aware that they're to bring it back to him, and he will rehome it. So if you're going to bring an animal into the world, it's your responsibility for the life of that animal to be contactable by the person you rehome it to and take responsibility for that animal. And the pet industry are actually just recently looking at that as well, that maybe they need to start to look at taking responsibility for the animals that they rehome. Cat breed organisations, amazingly, are totally supportive of kittens being desexed prior to sale or transfer. Absolutely want it to happen, because at the moment they do not have the power to make their members do it. And they totally agree that it is insane for anybody who doesn't want to be a responsible breeder to keep an undersexed cat. So they're on side as well. So there's absolutely no objection from the breeders to this legislation. Next one is a breeder permit system does little to target the true causes of pet homelessness. Well, we've just heard two causes for, well, there's more than just pet homelessness for dogs. There's issues of breeding conditions, as we've just seen. And breeder permit system does address that. For cats, of course, it's overbreeding is the issue. The breeding rate, the seasonal overload, and therefore desexing of kittens through the breeder permit system solves that. So really, basically, it covers the puppy mill issue and it covers the kitten desexing issue. Breeder permit legislation is an adversarial and draconian approach, other people have been saying. Well, it's actually not. It's been a totally collaborative approach developed with all stakeholders, supported by the breeders. The only issue we've had on the Gold Coast, which they've got a little bit disappointed with, is, as Jeff explained, that planning department rule where they could only have 4 animals. And we've had to spend 5 months and delay, people applying, because most of them are saying they want to have a couple of breeding animals and then they want to have some animals undesexed that may breed in the future to bring on new puppies. They want to keep their older animals. This is the good breeders. They want to keep their older animals so that they don't have to put them to sleep or get rid of them, which means they need at least 8 animals, they're saying. And we're saying, OK, well, we'll get through it by the 4 and 4 rule, as Jeff said. But we've had a long time trying to get that through. And there's huge benefits of a breeder permit system. It helps the pets, it helps the responsible breeders because they get acknowledged for doing the right thing and don't get mixed up with the ones doing the wrong thing. It helps pet owners, it helps vets because they'll have more responsibly owned pets coming to them for their whole lives. They get more desexing work to do, helps responsible sellers, helps communities and helps local government in prevention rather than reaction, and they get lots of community support for it. So the way forward, stakeholders need to work together to understand the data properly and not just listen to stuff that keeps getting regurgitated. We need to work on a national level. So that's why I'm really wanting us all here now, when we have some discussion and debate, to think about how we can move forward to start to all work on getting national movements towards the same thing, instead of all working on a hodgepodge, as Jade said. We need to develop a system that can address both poor breeding practices and oversupply of kittens. This is what I believe each group can do. So the AVA and the veterinary schools, as Jackie's already offered, can progress early age desexing knowledge and experience in current and future vet practices. And the AVA representative here was here yesterday, who met with me at lunchtime, said he'll be taking that message back to the AVA. So we hope that that will go somewhere. Breeder organisations, they can support the development of nationally consistent system of standards and inspections and desexing prior to sale or transfer of kittens. If the Queensland breeders, once they're more fully informed, can agree with it, provided we can just sit down and fully inform all our other breeder organisations in every other state, they will be able to understand that it isn't a threat to them. It's not meant to be a threat. It's about giving them accreditation for the good job that they do. Animal management needs to be able to run an efficient and ethical breeder permit system, provide desexing subsidies in conjunction with vets and animal welfare groups, prevent impoundment, as we heard yesterday from Mitch, and provide high standards of care and strong rehoming programs, as Nathan proposes in his legislation, in his Companion Animal Act. He wants legislation too. Animal welfare groups, we need to promote obviously our animals for rehoming, all our work on pet rescue, all our own great photos on websites, all the promotion we do. We need to contribute to the development of responsible breeding legislation nationally. So instead of just sitting back and believing some of this data, we need to stand up and say this is what we want and be part of the groups and not let ourselves be left out. Because what's happened in the past is there has been a predominance of the big national organisations involved in this work, and they tend to be predominantly pet industry groups. And I believe that we can work forward if we just understand the data and talk together. The pet industry and the animal welfare groups together need to be talking more and collaborating more so that we can get down to understanding the data better. Assist with provision of community and council-funded subsidised desexing services. Wouldn't it be great if that was all we had to do? Take in a few emergency animals and assist with desexing services once we get all of this underway. The pet industry bodies, they need to acknowledge that addressing the number of houses that are available for animals is the big issue for them. If we want more pets in Australia, we need to address those whole restrictive practices we have in multi-dwellings, in rental properties, and I just wish that they would be more proactive in that area and at the same time agree that desexing of kittens is necessary, because we can't do it unless we do both. And for the whole community, they need to adopt abandoned cats and dogs, and buy only from government permitted breeders where it's obvious they've either been inspected or they can go and visit them themselves. State governments need to progress the discussions and negotiations for development of nationally consistent responsible breeder permit systems. We don't have a national system of legislation in Australia, so we're not going to get that. But each state, and I believe it's our responsibility, will have to work with each state to liaise together with other states so that we can get some consistency, or otherwise we'll continue to have puppies and kittens traded across borders and everybody will be able to avoid the legislation because there's no consistency. And that's it. And we have a little video to show you just to lighten up a bit. I'm sorry that that was such a jam-packed information session. You've probably seen this before, but I only recently discovered, somebody sent it to me actually when I sent my presentation, and then she said, you need to lighten up a bit, Joy, it's all very serious, so play this.
I need somebody help, not just anybody help. You know I need someone help. When I was younger, so much younger than today, could have saved me then before the boys came here to play. Now I've had another litter, fifth one in a row. Some of them, they're having kids, it's out of control. Help me if you can, I'm feeling like a machine that just makes kittens, where's my life? Take me to the clinic, set me free. Won't you please save me?
Don't forget the males, you've got to know that it takes two. We can't drive to the clinic, it's all up to you. Dogs and cats, they don't need babies, population